Okay, well, we'll wait till 5 o'clock here and get going once we at least get the rest of our board on here. No Tambra tonight. She was not able to attend. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Hey, Seth, just checking in.
Yep, sounds good, Mike.
Thank you.
Do I need to do anything to stop the recording when it's over?
I think you probably have all the controls now. I can take back over as host at any time, Steve, but I think if you just hit stop.
No, I got it now. That's the only question I had. I think I've got this, no problem.
I'm going to leave it up, but I'll have to pop out and then pop back probably a couple times. So.
Okay, but it looks like all of our board members are on, and I saw Lynn come on. So Jen and Lisa, are you guys there?
Yes.
Lisa, I think I saw you on, right?
She's on there. She's got her mute on. There
Okay.
you go.
All right, well, let's get going. I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order and like to welcome you all to the Coeur d'Alene School District Special Board Workshop for April 20th, 2020. This meeting is being streamed live through Facebook, YouTube, and on Zoom. My name is Casey Morrisroe, and I'm the chair. Joining us this evening from the board is Miss Jennifer Brumley, our vice chair, Miss Lisa May, board member, Miss Rebecca Smith, board member, Dr. Steve Cook, our superintendent's with us, and Lynn Town, our clerk of the board also. Tambra Pickford, who's a board member, was unable to attend tonight's session, so she will not be with us. Let's see. No public comments can be accepted during tonight's workshop. Public comment received in writing prior to today's meeting was sent to the board if we received it before noon, and I think there was even one that snuck in a little after noon, as was noted on the agenda. Comments may still be submitted in writing through our board clerk at any time. Those issues will be recorded and referred to the proper staff person for follow-up. Let me just get over to our agenda here. Is there a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, any opposed? All right. So just briefly before we start tonight's meeting, I just wanted to mention Jason Peebles, who's a second grade teacher for our district out at Hayden Meadows. And unfortunately, he passed away unexpectedly about a week and a half ago. And I know it's hit the Hayden Meadows family hard. And I just wanted to take a moment just to reflect on that, a moment of silence, just to honor Mr. Peebles and offer some support to his family and his students and staff. So just real quick, a moment of silence for Mr. Peebles. Okay. So public comment here, as I mentioned, we're not taking public comment tonight. It was allowed to be provided earlier in writing. And we have a number of consent agenda items. Do we want to take those as a group or do we want to break those up?
I'm good with them as a group.
Okay. So is there a motion to approve tonight's consent agenda items?
So moved. Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on those? Okay, just real briefly, we did have the grading in there. You know, we had a meeting last week about that. I'd just like to thank our staff and our patrons and our students for a lot of comment we received on this. You know, after reviewing all that comment, I would say there was no perfect answer here. And I think we may have come as close as we could by allowing a couple different options. So I'm glad we were able to come up with that solution. So, any other comments? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Aye. Okay. All right, we're going to move on to some information items. And Dr. Cook, I'll turn it over to you for the first one, which is the school soft closure update.
Yeah, so three different things I think kind of to talk through. I'd like to talk a little bit about I'd like to finish up with the updates to the state board position on the school soft closures across the state. Prior to that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the operational things that are going on. And then I'm going to also have Katie Groutman, our Director of Curriculum, give you an update on how remote learning has started off in kind of our new posture. So first off, operationally, we are now feeding about an average of 2,400 meals a day. 12 to 1,300 kids each day are getting breakfast and lunch from us. And it's kind of, we've expanded because we have the ability to, and remember, we get paid for every meal that we feed kids. We get reimbursed for that. So it's actually to our benefit to expand this as much as possible. We're now up to about 100 to 150 meals a day that we're actually delivering on a home delivery because kids don't all have access and they can't get to any of our drop-off sites. And so that's also a pretty big success. And then we've established learning labs now, both of the emergency childcare centers, in which we now are staffing essentially computer labs at both of those locations with teachers and or administrative staff that can help students that are being dropped off at the emergency childcare centers, the ability to get some instructional support as they work through some of the work that they're being assigned as students that in our school district. All three of those things are going pretty well at this point, and a lot of teamwork and a lot of collaborative effort on that part. Next, I'd like to actually ask Katie if she would jump in and talk just a little bit about how remote learning is going up to this point. So Katie, if you could take just a minute.
Yeah, thank you, Superintendent Cook and Chair Morris-Rowe. So we just launched into week 3 of remote learning. The teachers in curriculum teams K-5 have identified essential standards for reading, math, and writing, and focused on priorities. we've been working out our best systems to try to deliver the learning remotely. And we've had some bright spots, and we've learned some lessons. We've seen authentic learning happening. We've seen kids who are able to engage in conferencing with each other and giving each other high fives and learning together, even though it's being done remotely, and that's been wonderful to see. We've also heard a little bit about some frustrations, and so we're working through those to try and calibrate and make them better. One of the things that we're going to be doing soon is some random sampling to get some feedback from parents about how things are going, and so that we can use that information to calibrate and adjust. Another thing that has happened recently is that administrators just received the ability to look in on Google Classroom, so they can sort of do these, it's the digital equivalent of a sort of a learning walk, so that they can know what's happening and see what kids are getting. So we have a lot of great things happening, but a lot of things that we can learn from and adjust and make better. And I'll stand for questions.
Okay, any questions for Katie or Steve on that?
Casey, I do want to, oh, go ahead. I'll finish up after. Go ahead.
No, you may
Trustee
be
May.
answering my question. You go first.
I do want to say we're going to have to do some pretty heavy communicating to the system now that we've changed the grading practices through the board action tonight. And I think that's going to be a point of emphasis here as we move forward, is how we can get the dialogue and the communication that's going in all of our schools a little tighter, and specifically in our 3 high schools. Now that we've got established grading practices that we're agreeing to, next step will be to get the communication to both sets of, or all 3 sets of families, to recognize what that's going to look like. And we're going to intentionally spend some time on making sure that communication is much more similar in nature, so that all the families are getting the same messaging. So we just don't wind up in a position where we were moving awfully fast when we were trying to figure things out prior to this. And I think maybe we wound up on some different pathways. And so I'm excited to take this in a more consistent fashion to all of our high school families, whether staff or students or families agree or not. This is where we've landed, and this is what we're going to deliver upon.
Steve, that was essentially my question. After reading all of the comments from staff and then from parents, it became pretty apparent that they're on 2 different interpretations of what remote learning looks like. And so I guess you kind of did answer my question. It seemed like the staff had a different perception than what our community or parents were experiencing. And maybe that's where the confusion or frustration over the adoption of this new resolution was stemming from, as I think parents viewed our schools physically closed, but that learning is continuing. And so they probably viewed it as a natural extension that new materials would be introduced throughout the rest of the year. Is that something that parents, can expect? I know some of the comments from teachers were that they were, reviewing and didn't have intention to introduce new topics. Can you touch on that briefly, I think?
Yeah, I can declare unequivocally that there will be, it is our intention that there will be new learning that's going on. That's the entire reason that we focused on trying to pare down the remaining quarter of the year and get it down to the essentials we felt like we needed our kids to have. And we're going to be explicitly communicating that as an expectation across the district. And so how that confusion got into be, there's lots of things that we could talk through, but I think right now it's important that we get on the same page and make that clearly articulated across our district for all 3 of our high schools.
That would be fantastic, because I think those are most of the questions that I've been fielding, is just, what to expect moving forward, and I think everybody appreciated how quickly the district responded to the school closure, but now I think we're pivoting and we're in a new phase, and really this is just preparation in case this happens again next year, and it'll help lay the foundation for distance or remote learning moving forward.
And if I may, Chair Morrisroe, just talk just for a second about the guidelines the state board has provided for us for how that might start to look, what it might look like as this year kind of phases through. So on Thursday, the state board approved the returning or reopening of schools guidelines, and those guidelines are pretty strict. Stricter than I expected to some extent. There's really 3 criteria. The first one is that there shouldn't be any kind of social distancing restrictions in place, either locally or regionally. Secondly, there should be some form of 14-day period of kind of this analysis of you're on the backside of the curve and there's not some substantial forms of reinfection. And then the third one is that the local health district must approve the plans. And those local plans have to be approved by the board and by the health district. And those include 7 criteria. The first one is to have a protocol for cleaning and disinfecting the school. The second one is how are you going to deal with and plan for vulnerable staff and vulnerable students that might be medically compromised. The third one is how do you address and deal with positions in the district that have to work in close quarters with other folks where it might be a challenge for them to socially distance, and what is our plan for how we're going to keep them safe in that act. How are we going to plan for absenteeism if kids either have a need because they're medically fragile, or maybe they test positive and they're going to need to be excluded, just almost the way that some of our vaccination policies might be. Additionally, we would need to have a fairly robust communications plan and how we're going to make sure that our community is aware of what moves we're making, and a point of contact assigned. And then health officials have to sign off on all these actions, which would include things that we would be doing to be functioning in a school, which means you have to have a plan for if a COVID case winds up in a school, what's that look like? Or if if we have a kid that comes to school and we identify that they have a fever and they rode the bus, and then how do we help with contact tracing on all those situations? Every one of those things is going to have to be part of the plan that we would have in place. And that's all predicated on us being able to start up school again, whether that's this fall or some mitigation of these measures, whatever they might be for, I meant this spring, or some factor of way these might be put together for next fall as well. And right now, there's no way to predict where this is going to go, but we're going to anticipate that we might have to, on a moment's notice, close down school, at least the physical structures of the buildings, and be prepared for some form of the way this may exist next fall. And so we're building our plans to be nimble and flexible as we get into the planning process. So hopefully we can have some of those things addressed before it gets path too far down the road. Thank you.
Okay, other questions about what Dr. Cook just shared there?
I just echo Lisa May's comments, and just glad there will be follow-up with staff that'll be uniform. With Dr. Cook's comments, I too echoed a similar concern as I walk through all of those comments. And so hopefully we'll all get on the same path.
I think for myself, I really appreciate, Dr. Cook, your comments about looking ahead to the fall to really be prepared, since we know not what it would look like, and even starting school and then having to potentially even stop. I'd really appreciate just being able to do that quickly with minimal interruption to learning as we try and re-achieve whatever we've not been able to achieve this spring. So real plans around that would be really, I think, well worth our staff's time and energies to plan for that.
Yeah, I agree with what Ms. Smith just said there. I think really looking at next year, as we get to the tail end of this year and kind of exhaust our efforts there as we move into summer, that we really be prepared for next year, not knowing what may happen. And, I think, if we find ourselves in the same situation, whether it's on a school basis or a class basis or district-wide, where we're, in a prolonged closure of the buildings, that, we're going to need education to take place in a more standardized manner, or a more traditional manner, I think is going to be the expectation, especially if it's something that we can be moving in and out of as we go through the next school year, where we could be in closure and open, closure, open. I think we need to figure out what that's going to look like and how can we keep learning continuing, on a traditional basis. So I appreciate that. Couple questions going back to when Katie was talking. Any idea as far as participation rates, what we're seeing as far as students coming in and at least logging in and checking in with teachers?
Chair Morrisroe, I don't have that information right now about what the actual participation rate is, but I can definitely look into that and get more information for you.
Okay, and then maybe on those same lines, I know we heard last week when we were talking about grading from the two comprehensive high schools about the number of students they've been unable to connect with. And I was just wondering what that looks like district-wide. If we have, an idea on that, how many folks we haven't been able to connect with, whether it's for health reasons or access or all those sorts of things. So. And then,
I know that we've been trying to track that. I think other members of our cabinet are better able to answer that. Is there?
That was funny. Anyone? Bueller?
I'll take that on. This is Jeff.
I was going to say Jeff has.
Yeah, we have started to track that, but we just asked the schools late last week to start that tracking, and we have a form where they're going to start providing that information for us. So I don't have the current information on that, but I do know we're underway. I know, I can just give you an example. Talking to Canfield Middle School, they worked really, really hard last week to contact as many students, and they went from 30 down to I think about 10 that they hadn't been able to get in contact with. So I know schools are working really hard to make those contacts and those connections through phone calls and doing everything they can just to reach out. And Canfield was an example, but I know all the schools are working as hard as they can to try to reach out and make those contacts. So, and I can probably by the end of this week I can get you more information as to what those exact numbers look like.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. And then just my final question around the closures, Dr. Cook, is what's the state doing on, from the funding mechanism, they calculate based on ADA. Obviously, we're not taking attendance. So I know they must have made some adjustment there. I just haven't heard what that was.
Yeah, there's two things that compete here. And one is the way that we're calculating attendance so that that informs our support units, which is how we're funded. And they've waived that entire process. And so since we're essentially at the end of the school year, our best 28 weeks and our first 10 weeks, essentially those are what are being used as funding mechanisms for calculation of the support units. And we're just getting funded on that. And they've waived all those responsibilities for now. The other one they've waived are the instructional minutes as we go forward, because every course that kids will get credit on require through the IDAPA rules, some form of minutes calculation, and they've waived that as well. So funding is done through attendance. Minutes in courses and instruction are what constitutes a credit. Both of those have come as waivers from the State Department. It gives us a little bit of relief on that. The one that we haven't heard yet that we're a little bit, that is going to be an interesting conversation is how do we go into the fall with this newer third tier on the career ladder and what that's going to look like with regards to an allocation model. As you know, that was passed by the legislature earlier later in the winter. And so that's going to be a little bit of a different look for us. And part of what we'll have to do with that is do some work on our evaluations system as well, because we've got to be able to come up with a distinguished measure to be able to be qualifying for that third rung. And so that's definitely something we're going to be working on in this off season.
Okay. Is that everything as far as number 3 there, the soft closure update? Dr. Cook?
Yes.
All right. Any other questions on that? Okay. Let's move along then to the policies for information. It's really the main purpose of tonight's workshop. Just briefly, it's been a while, maybe a few years since we've had a standalone policy workshop. And when I first got on the board, they were fairly common because we were tackling, the full sections of the policy manual. And now we hit, a half dozen or so a month. And so we haven't had to do those workshop sessions, but really this should be looked at as kind of our starting point with these policies. We did see these policies a few months ago, and I think at that point administration realized it was just too big of an animal to tackle in our traditional one meeting with a first reading and then action the next month type of a process. And so as chair, I would anticipate maybe up to 6 months that we could be working through these policies. Again, tonight's kind of the launching off point, and then we will collectively need to decide what else we want to do. I assume we'll be visiting both Ramsey and Sorensen and getting their feedback at some point as we maybe get a little closer on a policy model, and probably along the way, but at some point visiting those schools and have listening sessions, I think would be very appropriate before we take action. So again, this is a jumping off point. We're not going to solve it tonight. So make sure we're all on the same page. So Dr. Cook, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Chair Morris-Rowe. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to tell you is this was, when we started this conversation, it kind of started back around the time we started talking about the boundaries. And the first thing that we recognized was that we had to have a mechanism for getting kids into a policy and a procedure for getting kids into the enrollment into their magnet schools. And that quickly we found out in the build out or attempt to build that out, that we needed a policy that was really an overriding governing policy of why magnet schools exist. So what you have before you are really two completely different starting points. One is the starting point for why a magnet school, why would somebody ever want to develop a magnet school, and a policy that gives the board the authority and kind of the map for how somebody may wish to become a magnet school, and then what those obligations might look like in their existence as a magnet school, whether that's the intentionality of the programming that they're choosing and why they want to go in that programming, and then how they are then living under the auspices of what that programming looks like. So 9810, policy 9810 is the policy that speaks specifically to that. So we've got a starting place for you on that one. And then the second one that we kind of played around with, and we've got both Annie Harris and Megan O'Dowd here who have helped us with this conversation. And I'm going to call upon those two and Dr. Orozco and Jeff Voller, our Director of Operations, to also opine when you guys have questions regarding how these policies for how you then enroll students into a magnet school. And I think I'll speak for that group, and I think we agree on the fact that we want, when kids choose or families choose to claim a magnet school and get into a magnet school, we want to set that up as a homeschool experience, so that once you're in that environment, so you can fully commit. But then it gets very, very tricky after that, because you're actually establishing criteria for a school that separates it from neighborhood schools, and maybe even the criteria that you're using for how those students get in don't necessarily have to look the same for all of your magnet schools. And so we've taken some liberties on building out 3012 and 3012P to try to start the conversation on how we think some considerations for the board to have some control on what the board might value as levers and mechanisms for how you control enrollment of magnet schools, so that in the future, as they populate through policy, the students that would be enrolling in them, the board doesn't fall to entropy in the fact that people are going to come and go as they do, and the next thing you know, you've got this strange dynamic at any magnet school that's left essentially with no policy to govern them by. And I think one of the things that we found out through this discussion was that currently the things that were the most effectively managing the enrollment at both of our magnet schools was the fact that they were out of space, and that they had a pretty nice application form that had some very strong statements about it. So I'll stop there, and I'll let any of the four of the Annie or Megan or Jeff or Dr. Roscoe lean in here to give you kind of some more lay of the land on where we've chosen to start this conversation with you guys.
Well, I know I will. Good evening, everyone. I think I'll be curious when we sort of start to dig in. I'll be curious to know the board's reactions to the language, because I think 9810's fairly clear, and maybe the standards for enrollment in 3012 are fairly clear, and then you get into the procedures and you get into those 3 different possibilities, and it gets a little more interesting. So I'll be interested to hear what you think about the documents, especially the procedures, and if our understanding of magnet schools that I think Megan did such a good job of sort of kind of creating a definition, if our understanding of that sort of matches what you had expected, as we've been experiencing magnet schools here in the district for some time, and now to take a step back and sort of define again and create standards for that probably felt for some people like the cart before the horse a little bit. So I'll be curious to hear your reactions to some of the documents.
Good evening. I'll just add a few other notes. Magnet schools aren't creatures of statute in Idaho. They are in some states, but they're not in Idaho. So we, in terms of when the board is looking at 9810 and kind of our thought process, I think after the meeting a few months ago, it was recognized that it's a little odd to have enrollment statutes without an initial, or enrollment policies without an initial policy on how to recognize a magnet school and how the board is going to renew that status and kind of govern that status, if you will. So we modeled this a bit after what Idaho code does use for charter schools. All of that's malleable based on what I'm really looking forward to hearing what the board has to say, because then we can make the adjustments that the board needs and wants to really meet the policy decisions that you guys make over these next coming months. But just so you understand, that is where we did use some guidance from charter school statutes, and just with some of the historical background of where magnet schools did originate, and they were really started to try to match or try to achieve some racial desegregation goals. They've certainly expanded from that initial purpose, but the overarching difference is that although there may be focused schools or themed programs, a magnet school across the board always tries to pull kids in from across the district, and maybe with different goals. So that's kind of how we were trying to give the board the most authority that we could in drafting, so that the board would decide when a magnet school is created, what sort of criteria it expects the school to meet to maintain that status, and that's all governed by 9810. And in that process, normally the board would probably be identifying what enrollment goals they might have for a particular magnet school, and we also gave the board the discretion to set different goals for different schools, because there may very well be different goals for different schools. And then that's where 3012 really comes into play. That's just kind of the implementation of the priorities and the criteria that the board sets at the beginning, that then you can implement based on one of a variety of models. We've given you kind of 2 models. There's a 1A and a B, which is just a variant of the same thing. And then there's a totally different model B, with the idea that, the board could pick one of those for magnet schools, one or the other, and maybe even create more in the future. So that's just some of the background there.
I think a couple points I'd like to note too are just, the fact that let's all take a minute just to remember this is our starting point right now. We anticipate that this may be a complex process, much like the boundaries were. And, to not feel the pressure to solve this today, but to just, start the conversation, to work through this and find out what are your guys' questions and some of your expectations that can guide us moving forward on this. And the other point that I want to make here too is I think we're pretty intentional about putting some language in here that says, this policy then should be reviewed every 3 years so that we can continue to make changes as demographics change surrounding the magnet schools. And, I think it's important for us to circle back to this every once in a while, as this language outlines in here so that, we continue to make the best decisions for the district as we can. And there is some room to change that from year to year as we continue to review this.
And I think the only other thing I'd like to add is that when we first started talking about how many versions of policy we should write, one of the things that we didn't take for granted, but didn't necessarily determine was the factor for controlling things like demographics, if you will, is currently right now, there's nothing really that defines what a priority zone is as far as what the boundaries of it are. And that may or may not be one of the most influential leveraging tools the board may wish to put into policy, is to have that codified in some fashion that the board then can control as the board sees fit. But it's something that we could definitely put into place if that's the board's, if you're so inclined. Currently, we've talked about the possible ways that you could influence, the levers, if you will, of how you get those kids into a school and how those then could be controlled by policy and procedure both. And that's one that, we could almost write it like a plat for what the zone would look like for each of the schools, and or if you don't want a zone for one of the magnet schools, because there's nothing that states that those need to even exist if the board is so inclined to make that change. And so it's we didn't start with that because we were wanting to get some starting places and get some feedback from you guys before we went down the path of building out legal language for what a priority zone might look like for either or both of our magnet schools currently.
Okay, Dr. Cook, was there someone else in there that you were asking to chime in before I open it up for questions from the board?
I'd invite Annie. Annie Harris has helped us write so much policy on this. If she has anything she'd like to lean in on here, she's more than welcome.
Hi. I think Megan mostly covered it. Basically, the reason we have so many different models for you to look at is that different goals have been expressed throughout this process. And with respect to Ramsey versus Sorensen, there was talk about the socioeconomics of each school looking different than the schools across the district. And there's been talk about, wanting a neighborhood school versus the whole district. So we've just kind of fiddled with that so that you could actually see, what that lottery process is going to look like if we're trying to meet certain goals. So yeah, I'm interested to hear the board's thoughts as well.
Okay, so why don't I open it up for comments or questions? And I don't know if we want to talk about maybe 9810 first, which is the creation of a magnet school, and then go to the enrollment, just to keep things clear, I think might work better. So if we start with 9810, then we'll talk about 3012. So questions or comments on 9810?
I'll go. So a couple of the things I wrote down. Generally speaking, I didn't see anything significant that I didn't like or to change, or I thought it was a great starting point. And what I look forward to is just having feedback from the community about it. But do we currently require an annual report or have a 5-year renewal policy? Is this all brand new? That's one question.
It's all brand new. So we're we're writing this from the lens of what would it look like if you were going to apply and then you were awarded the opportunity to be a magnet school. And then now as a magnet school, what your accountability to the district, the governing, the board, that would look like. And so.
Okay. I would definitely want feedback from our admin in those two schools on the cumbersomeness of maybe an annual report, or if that's, I don't know, maybe the board likes that, but I'd just like their feedback on that. That was one of my thoughts then, if it's not something that's in place. And then the term preferred priority zone, where did that come from? Because it seems like a big fat mouthful that I would love to change. It's just me. So if everybody else likes it, great. But I don't know any parent that's ever gonna understand that when they just read it. And so, or you say those words. And I know we've talked about it as an overlay, and I think there's been some time to adapt to that concept. So I would just leave those out as my general comments on that policy.
I could answer where the preferred priority zone came from. Quite honestly, they're not common. An overlay isn't a common thing that exists when you talk about magnet schools, or a zone that is in which a magnet school draws more kids from. There's some modeling out of some schools out of Texas that showed similar kinds of language, and I think that's where the preferred priority zone might have come from. It was just one of us picked something, and I don't remember who actually. I'll blame Jeff because he's muted, so he can't defend himself.
I'm pretty sure it was you. And even when you shorten it to PPZ, it doesn't have a nice ring, does it?
No. I think at one of the open houses, I heard it referred to as the PP zone. Didn't sound great either. Okay, thank you, Ms. Brumley, for your comments and questions there. Either Rebecca or Lisa, one of you guys want to chime in?
Rebecca, you go for it.
Yeah, I think actually, Jen, that was one of my first questions, was just how did we land there with the differences? And I guess a couple of my questions will really go on to the next one. I have questions regarding just the 50%, but maybe that's the next policy. So is there anything else we should know about or consider regarding some of the charter school? And maybe this is a question for you, Megan. Anything else that we should consider, I guess, regarding charter school policies that really kind of affect our magnet schools, or maybe just speak a little bit more for us about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So the statutes on charters absolutely do not apply. So it is not legally mandated. They are not governing in any way. And that's what we tried to make clear. Like, magnet schools, they absolutely are just one of the public schools in our district, and you guys are going to treat them like one of your schools. The only thing that really is different is you guys are recognizing a thematic specialty, and then we are going to create enrollment that's unique. So I guess the only other thing that results from this is it kind of creates that open enrollment. All of the students are kind of applying as an open enrollment because there is no home school zone for these two existing magnet schools. But to your question, no, that the charter schools, it doesn't apply. It's not mandatory in any way. They may be too heavy-handed, frankly. We use some of it as a starting place just to give us some ideas, but the board is not married to them in any way. They could simplify it. We did see it though, because 9810, if obviously there's two in existence already, but the board may very well be entertained with a request in the future for another school to become a magnet. And it certainly seems like we were putting the cart before the horse by doing all of these enrollment procedures and policies without creating kind of the original mechanism for the board. And if part of the level of the detail was to help the board and put that burden back on the school when applying, for them to tell you guys what their goals are by thematic specialty, what their enrollment goals are, and then the board can tweak that and approve it and apply, you know, kind of, it would be a trickle down decision then, and hopefully enrollment would be a very easy implementation based on the approval mechanisms that were originally put in place.
I'd add one other thing too, Megan, and I think having worked with a number of, just with some districts who have had magnet schools, one of the things that I think sometimes people almost expect that magnet schools, because they are a theme-based, or sometimes it's just to draw people into an area of a city that needs regrowth, or that sometimes magnet schools reach out to school boards and ask for kind of dispensations from certain, you know, from certain policies in order to better fulfill their educational program. I know that you all know that, like, for instance, at Sorensen, they have a schedule that differs a little from the rest of the schools, from the rest of the elementary schools, in order, you know, to, you know, their Friday afternoons are professional development, and they use that chunk of time. That's the kind of thing, those kind of minor departures from the way everybody else is doing things, that we sometimes see in magnet schools. And it doesn't mean they don't have to go in front of the board and ask for those, but those are the kinds of things that sometimes also separate magnet schools that I think you're all aware of too.
Rebecca, I think, Kate, you kind of hit on that too, and Megan, you did also, and I think for me, it's important to designate that these are not charter schools. And I do wonder about the clause in there that's requiring magnet schools to provide academic achievement reports. You know, they're a thematic emphasis, and their standards are exactly the same as any other elementary school in our district. And so are we somehow putting them in a different box? I mean, I think Dr. Roscoe can speak to this, that she's monitoring results and assessments from all of her schools every year annually. And if there was a dip or something that was concerning, I know that she would bring that to the board's attention. But I do wonder, by requiring magnet schools to provide additional reporting, are we kind of teetering away from what the purpose of a magnet school is? I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud. I don't know that it seems necessarily fair, because all of our schools already report annually achievement data. So is it just repetitive, and is it necessary?
I think that's a good point. You know, I think every year we do look at achievement data from all the schools, and we also, you know, we look at school improvement plans, and we look at what they're, you know, and administrators sit down annually with me and with our team, and we discuss the goals, you know, learning goals and staff development goals and those kinds of things. So maybe it's quite reasonable just to sort of expect from magnet schools what we see the other schools doing in terms of reporting. The thing that something I can imagine is if a new school comes before the board and says we'd like to be a magnet school, and you have some questions about whatever that theme might be or something, maybe a brand new school comes before you, one that, you know, we've seen success with Sorensen and Ramsey, you know, years of success, but perhaps it might be reasonable for a board to request additional kind of, I don't know if the reporting's the right word, but some additional accountability in the first couple years, say, of a magnet school. Or, I mean, that just might be something to think about. I'm not sure that how it needs to be
more reasonable to me. I just would hate to set the expectation that magnet schools are somehow so much different than our traditional schools, because we have pretty amazing elementary schools and middle schools across the board. And I think asking them to provide more evidence of their achievement, I don't know that there's merit in that. It'd be nice to hear from them if they think what they're doing is driving academic achievement. I think that would be something that we could celebrate, and every year it'd be nice to have a report from them on what they're doing to incorporate their focus into their daily enrichment. But yeah, I'm thinking out loud, and I think it's something that we should go to the community and to definitely administrators and see how they feel about it. But I wouldn't want to create policy that more separates our magnet schools from our traditional elementary schools.
I would wonder, and I agree with that, I would wonder though about the program focus and some sort of something that might even help them in their, you know, if they were going to go after grants and that kind of thing, that they could use and double up with and just say, hey, this year, here's how we achieved our program purpose. and really focus it in on, this is the uniqueness of our school, and here's the ways that we sought to achieve that, because that is slightly different than our other traditional.
Yeah, and if they were programmatic, if it was a programmatic report, I would be much more comfortable with that than truly an assessment or something.
Yeah, I take the uniqueness of that school and say, hey, here's how we achieved our program purpose this year.
I think that's part of what we're trying to balance is this idea of what would it look like, number one, not to both just task Ramsey and Sorensen with needing to go start these new reporting mechanisms, but if all of a sudden there became some significant energy across the district for a bunch of folks to get together and say, hey, we need a I don't know, some other school of some kind, and the 200 parents come together and some building administrators say, hey, I'd like to be a part of that too. What expectations would the board have if they said, we think we can get this pulled together and we want to put a school in the old Hayden Lake site next year because it's going to be available now that Nex is moving over to the new building? What would that look like? And the board would want to have some opinions on what that might look like. And so it isn't necessarily that we're looking for ways to burden our existing schools, but with 9810, the whole idea is what is that threshold that the board would say, you need the following. If we're going to be considering you seriously as a magnet for our district, these are our expectations.
Yeah. I had one other thought, when Sorensen was in its infancy, one of the requirements, and I don't believe it was policy, and I'm trying to think who would remember. Casey, you might remember, but there was a mechanism that they had to demonstrate fundraising capacity. And I don't know if that's something that we want to add in here, but I think that was included. It was during a downturn in the economy, and they wanted to make sure that the magnet school would not require additional resources. And I see that we've covered that in the policy, but is that something that you think should go by the wayside? It's created some inequity, I think, in some of our schools, just the initial thought process that fundraising is part of having a magnet school to pay for the additional programming. It's not mentioned in here, but I know that it's definitely happening at our two current magnet schools.
Boy, I think that's a good point. I think any board would want to be careful, right? That if a group comes together to explore the possibility of opening another magnet school, the board would want to know, okay, if you're going to be the aeronautical school for the area, and it's going to it's going to require a whole heck of a lot of rockets. You want to know, right, that's not an additional burden that's coming out of the general fund budget. I mean, those are reasonable expectations, and I think probably it depends on the educational program that they're trying to stand up. And so I'm assuming, I read those old documents too, I'm assuming that was the reason why they had that language in there. And I think you've said it, I think that there's been, I mean, we heard a little bit in some of those boundary discussions, kind of sideline conversations, that there's been some concern that, that they seem to have so many more resources than our other schools, right? And that's that's probably something we have to talk about, at least down the road for new schools, I'm thinking.
Only comment I had on 9810, I think it was a nice start, considering we're starting from scratch. It feels maybe a little heavy-handed to me in some of those requirements. And one I just question, and I assume it came probably from charter schools, is just the every 5 years the magnet school needs to come for the board and ask for continuation. And I just wonder, you think, I'm going to put it in football terms, but you have your coach, your college coach is in the last year of his contract. Not a lot of people want to go play for that coach because they don't know if he's going to be there the next year. And if you're in year 4 or 5 of that magnet process, I just wonder, does that, hurt with staff morale and school morale, for parents and interest and those sorts of things? Do we feel that's necessary? It certainly hasn't been the process with Ramsey and Sorensen. And while I recognize at times over the years, there's been discussions about whether those magnets were something a particular board wanted to continue on with. I don't know. That seems like a big hoop and just creating some uncertainty to me that I'm not sure is warranted or why it's warranted. So.
And Chair Morris, or just to address that, I think I'm really grateful to hear the board feedback too, because it you know, you're making this up without any direct feedback from, so it's important for us, I think, to hear this, because I don't think we know quite how much, how integrated the board wants to be, how frequently, I mean, do you want to approve them at the outset and, you know, never hear from them again? And I mean, the board would always retain control, and we could just do that, or does there want to be some sort of check-in, how informal? I think those points about the minimizing, you know, and certainly nobody needs to add more work to the administration staff for either of these schools. So I think those are great points. And to just have a better understanding of kind of the feedback loop of the board and how frequent they want to be hearing from these schools, if at all, and to kind of what degree will be super helpful.
Yeah, I think it was Trustee May just mentioned, you know, Ramsey and Sorensen, when they started up, they had some goals that I think the board set around fundraising and enrollment, interest, those sorts of things. And I think maybe we need to make it clear in here that as part of a new application and a new school, that there may be requirements that the board sets out, and that, you know, we're going to monitor those over the initial, whatever we say, 2, 3, 4 years, just to make sure that the program is attractive, it's meeting the needs of our community, it's, you know, has the appearance of long-term success. You know, I would think it's in those early few years, that's where the oversight's going to be extremely critical. And once you have a proven model, I don't know that there's as much need for what we have here or what we've suggested here.
And the only other thing I was thinking about is, you know, we do have 2 magnet schools that are completely different as far as size and programming, and we've never had a problem filling any of our magnet schools. But moving forward, this policy doesn't mention that if a new magnet school is created and the preferred attendance zone or preferred priority zone is small enough where we need to draw several hundred students and that's not happening. Do you think we need to have that, you know, mentioning in the initial, you know, first 3 years, you know, they have a certain time frame to fill capacity at the school, because it would be harder to transfer a student, I think, into a
yeah.
So is that something that we want to have in there, you know, for future schools, or even, you know, as we're looking towards Ramsey in the years to come, you know, we re-boundary things may be different as enrollment, our enrollment number is an important piece of it. And if we have a school that's not filled, how would we handle that? And could we transfer students to a magnet school? Kate, that might be a question for you, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think one of the things is the very definition of magnet school implies that it's going to draw kids and families there, right? And so if it's not able to do that, if a magnet is not able to be a magnet, then I do think that ought to give us pause as a district or as a board. But you mentioned, you know, some enrollment or transferring, and you all know that we've had to do a little bit of that. We've had to really relax, in some cases, kind of really relax those application processes in order to help that whole Winton Ramsey enrollment kind of discrepancy that we saw since Winton was built, essentially. So. I guess my general opinion is that there ought to be some requirements of a magnet school that are carefully examined in the first few years, and certainly its ability to draw students and families to itself as a school ought to be maybe a part of that. And then makes sense to me to have a gradual release of that reporting procedure, that it, as we see success, that's relaxed over over at least the first 2 or 3 years, I'd say. I think Casey, you said maybe 4, but whatever that length of time is.
I think that I would advocate that there's some language in policy 9810 that gives the board some authority if it's a 400 student school and in 12 years the programming starts to fall off or something happens and they can't fill out enrollment. I think there's got to be some way, whether it's not, maybe every 5 years is too heavy-handed, but there needs to be some triggers for what's going on for the board to say, hey, we have concerns. Why are things going on there? And maybe the declining enrollment to some extent when it's some percentage or something where it's like there's obviously some concerns we have that would trigger the board's interest to get back in and perhaps lean in a little bit. I think that was the intent with the 5 years. And I lived in another state in an environment in which a 5-year annual or a 5-year review, that review started at 3.5 years and it was done essentially by the end of the 3rd year. And so it didn't become that example like Chair Morrisroe was talking about the coach on his way out or that kind of thing. But I do think there needs to be some triggering mechanism that makes the board that gives the board the ability to say, hey, we've got concerns and we want to address that. Not because I think either of our current magnet schools are at risk or anything, but I do think there needs to be that's the whole reason for the policy to exist, is to establish the reasons for a magnet school to exist and then to intervene when something needs to happen.
And Trustee May, I think this is potentially what you were asking about. There is specific language, as Superintendent Cook suggested, where the board retains the right to both revoke a magnet school designation. So if a new school came on and year 2 they still just cannot fill the seats, the board at all times would certainly retain that power and could revoke that status at any time. And then under the definition of the preferred priority zone, the mouthful, whatever we rename it, there is language in there that kind of outlines what the board might be looking at in setting that. And I'd be interested to hear some thoughts on that language as well. It pops up again in the enrollment in 3012, but at the very end there, it's clear that the board also sets those boundaries. So, if enrollment wasn't being satisfied because we thought, potentially the way that the lines were drawn weren't big enough or whatever, you guys would certainly at any time, even though it's written right now, you guys would formally review that every 3 years. At any time you could revisit that.
Just quickly, I think it's important that we highlight the fact that the board has that right, and it's in the policy. It's on the last paragraph of page 2, and that's the board reserves the right to revoke a magnet school at any time. Next line says, additionally, the board may attach conditions to any approval for renewal status. And I just wonder if we go away from that 5-year review, if that's something we don't do, that maybe it's, the board can attach conditions to any approval, or excuse me, for continuation or something like that, that we're not renewing, but just for continuation. So that way, if you did see the declining enrollment or the difficulty fundraising or staffing or, whatever it is, that you could come in and not just say, sorry, you're gone, but say, hey, we have some concerns. You're unable to fill the seats. We're going to give you a year to bring enrollment up. And if enrollment doesn't come up, we may look to make some programmatic changes or whatever it is. Okay. Any other questions or comments on 9810? Okay, so why don't we move on to the other one? I did notice just now on 9810, we've got the page numbers wrong at the bottom. So just when we're cleaning those up. It's the right page number, but it says 3012 instead of 9810 on it. Okay, so let's move over to policy 3012. I will say I just got a notice on my iPad here that I'm down to 10% battery and I don't have my charger with me. And these darn iPad Pros don't use any of the other Apple chargers, so I don't have a charger for it. I thought I could get through. I have my laptop, so at some point if I drop off, if we go on, I'll come back on my laptop. But trying to run 2 computers so I can follow the agenda and the documents, so I'm using my laptop for that. So, Steve, do you want to introduce 3012 or just get right into comments?
No, I think I'll introduce it just briefly. There's 3 models. 2 of them are quite similar, and you notice those are listed as Model 1A and B. And then Model 2 has a more kind of explicit kind of focus on social emotional, on low SES and how it would balance potentially enrollment. We tried as best as I think we could to kind of compare these 3 versions of essentially just how do we get kids into the schools in that grid. And I think it's a pretty interesting and useful way to look at those 3 different takes on this. And I think the thing we'd like to start with, I would assume from your guys' feedback, is whether or not some of the language for enrollment fits what you're hoping for. And secondly, whether or not the goals of how we're enrolling kids into our magnet schools are being met based upon that. And so, and it kind of depends, like if you think of the lens of our magnet schools individually, it gets a little bit more challenging. And there was quite a bit of discussion on whether or not you establish, when you establish the magnet school, maybe you establish the rules for enrollment for the magnet school, and rather than to try to have one governing policy for how that fits, because there is a completely different set of circumstances at Sorensen than there are at Ramsey, because they're completely different environments, and one's bound by a very small population to be able to put into a school, and one's a very large school. So those are 2 completely different sets of circumstances, and we very well may want different policies for how to enroll those students. But that's the starting place where we took that on, and so we just like to open that up to comment and questions for you guys. And before you guys jump in, I do want to mention I've got both Brett Depew and Crystal Cabista available. If you guys want specific questions on them, we can tag them in on this, as long as I don't screw it up.
Okay, someone want to go first on 3012 with their comments or questions? Not all at once. Battery's down to 9. We better go quick.
Could you, whoever, speak a little bit to where we landed and how we got to the 50-50? I mean, a lot of that came out of boundary work that was being done, but maybe just start there, because that affects a lot of different things, and maybe we can start with what that looks like and means, and that'd be helpful for me.
Once again, I'm going to say this is Jeff's responsibility, but I'll do my best to answer this. When Jeff and I started talking about data for magnet enrollment, as we were doing the boundary work, we pulled, was it 4 or 5 years worth of data, Jeff? I think that we looked back on. And there's the distribution of kids going into both schools, both Ramsey and Sorensen, coming out of the overlays, and then coming out of the rest of the kids coming from across the district. That balance hovered around the 50% for each of the last 4 or 5 years. And so the 50% isn't necessarily a hard number. It's the number that we established as it strikes that 1 year Ramsey was 46 in zone, and then the next year it was we expanded it was 1 year the zone was 61%, and then we expanded the overlay zone to include some of the new areas up around Hawks Landing, and it went down to 47. And Sorensen just hovered back and forth right on either side of 50% for the overlay for those 5 years. And I think that's where we started, because there wasn't any kind of policy for existence as to why those mattered and whether or not we wanted to have an overlay. And in fact, we both started asking at the time when we first started talking about boundaries, we asked the question, why do we even have an overlay? And it kind of came from this lens of, if you weren't going to stay, and I think actually Trustee May was the one that solved this for us, was that when Sorensen first opened, it was for those families that didn't want to stay in Sorensen, they had to have a way to code them back to a school. And so they actually, the overlay was for when you wanted to leave Sorensen to go to another school, you had to be assigned through an attendance zone. And so here we've come almost full circle, and now you've got these attendance zones that are feeding enrollment into the magnet school through the overlay model. And that's really the best definition that we could come up with for why overlays existed. And so when it comes to 50%, similarly, it was just a starting place based upon where we had historical data for.
I'll also add that during the boundary committee, we did look at some models that were 30%, but I think 50% seems to be the average that we do have and across the district. Sorensen seems to be just a little bit under that 50% mark, probably more averaging about 45 to 47%. But if we're going to find some balance, we were just using 50% as kind of a round number to be as a target that seemed to be kind of the average that we could look at.
Could we go back really quick, Dr. Cook, to what you said a little bit ago? And could you share maybe some of the drawbacks, besides being cumbersome, to maybe each magnet school having slightly separate policies based on the, and maybe I didn't hear you right, but really looking at that, given that they're very different and maybe future magnet schools might look different as well. Could you come back to that and maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, that was actually very specifically part of the conversation we had with what you essentially want to set a magnet school up for success. If we agree that this is a good service that our district would be providing, you then could build policies that help that magnet school draw its enrollment in a way that fits both the need of the magnet school and the needs of the neighboring school districts in which it might be either competing with kids locally or regionally across our entire district. And so it would duplicate the amount of policies right now, I suppose, if we were going to do that. But if we were also intended to consider new magnet schools in the future, you'd have to have consideration for whatever the policies for attendance might look like. With a simple change to 9810, if you chose, you could capture sentences or two to say that when new magnet schools come along, or if magnet schools aren't filling the enrollment needs that schools in the region have or they compete with, that these enrollment policies should be tweaked or changed by the board. So it wouldn't necessarily be that cumbersome. It would be, I think that, and I don't want to speak for Brett or Crystal, but I think they've both kind of functioned like we're in this together, I think, in the way that they've lived in this world, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so I think that's something that they would definitely tell you they would have thoughts on, I would assume. And they might not agree with me about the idea of having different procedures for how they both get enrolled.
Thanks, just was considering, that was just an interesting different thought. Thank you.
Are we free to ask questions? First, thank you for all the work, Megan. I'm sure this was cumbersome and difficult to kind of create our first go at magnet policy. It's a lot to process, and as a parent who went through this 12 years ago, I walked down, or I'm sure it wasn't online, filled out the application, turned it in, and it was simple and it was basic and it was straightforward enough where a parent had, to make this commitment to a school outside of we called it overlay, I guess, or your homeschool then. Well, it takes a leap of faith. And so seeing this, it gives me a little bit of pause for families and wondering, there's so many outs in the policy for students. Does it provide enough security for families, or can we simplify it in a way where it doesn't seem quite so daunting? I know we're going to go through pieces of it little by little, but generally speaking, we talk a lot about this 50-50. And initially, I will say, when Sorensen opened, we weren't even close probably to the 50-50 because more students were choicing in, right? And so that wouldn't even have been something that was possible. And that was the reason why they became a magnet school, was to grow population at that school. And so I wonder if the 50-50 is more a guideline, if it's a rule of thumb, if it's something that we even need moving forward, because the paradigm of magnet schools has changed so much. And for each magnet school, it's probably a little bit different, whether you're a new magnet school, you're a self-sustaining magnet school. Is the 50-50 the hard, fast litmus test for every school? I'm not sure that it is the right approach. We've used it in the past and it's worked, but for every school, will it work? I don't know. And can we word the language in a way that it's just as a guidance, if that's what the board's pleasure is? And we haven't really all talked about that. That's my first thought. The other overarching concern that I had is when we're talking about SES and maintaining or determining this similar SES across the district. The boundary review process, I think, illuminated the lack of equity that we have all across the districts. And none of our schools really have matching SES. I can say, the downtown schools are all pretty close, minus Sorensen. Our northern schools are pretty close. And so if we're looking to achieve similar SES, and Kate, you can probably help. What does that look like in your mind? Because I couldn't really imagine that working well at both schools because of where they're located and where a magnet school and its preferred priority zone is going to affect what the applicant's SES look like, because Sorensen, for instance, we know is revitalized. And so what the overall SES downtown was 10 years ago is definitely different now. And Ramsey's, I think, is probably very different also for those living inside the preferred priority zone. So what would be your overall, if a parent was to ask you that, what would you be looking for applicants to have an analogous SES? What is that number, or what does that mean?
I don't know. I think so. Like, I'm thinking about probably some of the. I have two thoughts. One is that you try to match the SES of your neighborhood, and the other way is to try to match the SES of the district, right? But I think the grounding intent of that is always that question of if we stand up a really rich, interesting educational program, for which children and families do we want to reserve that, right? And so, I think that's the grounding idea behind the notion of worrying or fretting about SES at all anyway, is what kinds of possibilities might we give kids, right? So, and one of the things that seemed to become more clear to me in the boundary discussions is that the preferred priority zone idea would offer some flexibility, because that could be shifted, right? It could, right. So, so in my mind, I think that's probably that's a pretty powerful discussion for the board to have, is to entertain the idea. What do you think we want? What does our community want for magnet schools in general? Do we want them to have very unique educational programs with a lot of liberty within that, but with the notion of being able to serve a wide variety of kids and families? And if so, then how do we sort through the different procedures that might get us there? But
And I spent all weekend thinking about this, and what is the best way to go about it? Is it of the community, the neighborhood of the school? Is it the overarching number for the district? And looking at the map of our district and kind of the boundary work, it kind of dawned on me that people are choicing in to magnet schools, not always because they're a fan of the program being offered at the school. I think we came to realize that through the boundary review process. While the programs are great, I think parents are choosing in oftentimes for schools because they want something different for their child. And so I wonder if our open enrollment policy must also mimic this, if we're going to SES equalization, because it's the same opportunity for a parent to choice into a new school for a different learning experience. And so then do we have to apply the same principle to that open enrollment policy, because we have schools and pockets in our district? Dalton's a prime example. They've had lots of open enrollment spots, and I'd be curious to see what the SES is of those families choicing into Dalton, for instance. And I think I'm glad this is a starting point for the conversation. I'd like to hear the community's input on it, but I think it's a possibility. I would just like to see consistency then across the board in all of our policies where parents are choosing a different learning option for their student.
I think one thing I think I don't want to also forget is that nothing prevents any neighborhood school also from doing like Fernan did and setting itself up as also a school grounded in a particular interest with a particular educational program. And I want to keep that in mind, because I think the more we continue to grow our abilities to respond to the needs of the kids and to become more innovative, and we create this portfolio of schools that really do focus on very interesting learning experiences, it may become very true that people are really happy with their neighborhood school, that open enrollment just isn't that necessary, right? Yeah.
One last thing to know, everybody has lots of comments. There's one other thing that jumped out at me, and it was the clause in there that talked about magnet schools being required to provide busing. I didn't know if that was an oversight, and we meant it to read, the district will provide busing, but it's, I think it's on the second page, and it's listing off some of the things that must happen, and busing was one of them, but I didn't know that our schools were in the business of, oh yeah, no, it's on the first page. Yeah, and it says, the board will also require that each magnet school provide enrollment incentives, and it goes on, and it talks about busing. Let me see if I can find it.
Says such as increased busing opportunities and increased advertising.
Yeah. So I thought for a minute, wow, I didn't know that an elementary could provide their own busing, elementary school, or really resources for advertising. That to me seems like it's a centralized task. So I didn't know if that was just an oversight or if that was the intention, and that would come out of a school budget then, or I'm not sure. Yeah.
So Trustee May, I want to ask a question, if I may. I am fascinated by your open enrollment comment. And are you, I just want to make sure I understand your proclivity for this, are you suggesting that if we're going to try to balance at our magnet schools, that it might be worth consideration balancing through the open enrollment process as well? So for example, if we would set some kind of filters in place that Dalton we could accept open enrollments that might normalize the SES at Dalton that would be compared to the district norm, or vice versa, that we might allow non-free and reduced lunch kids to open enroll, be more open to the idea of them doing that at Winton, for example, so that we're trying to essentially regress towards the mean for both of those levels. Is that, do I understand that correctly?
Well, I was just challenging the notion of what are we really trying to achieve, right? I mean, these are schools of choice, whether it's a magnet school or you're choosing to go to a school that's not your assigned home school. And I think what we found in the boundary review process is that if you look at the numbers and who's choosing open enrollment, there was definitely a trend and a pattern. And it was families who had access to transportation and families who were in the know on how to complete an open enrollment process. And it's analogous to a magnet policy in that, except for there's no area of emphasis or the school hasn't become a magnet school, but parents are utilizing it, I believe, in some same way. And so I'm not asking that we make a decision tonight. I just think it needs to be part of the dialogue. And I'd like to hear the community's opinion of it. And just to get some more data, I'd like to see the SES numbers of open enrollment. I think we would probably find they're pretty similar to many of our students who are choosing magnet schools. And so I think our issue lies more with providing free, or not free, equal, easy, transparent access to all of our magnet schools and open enrollment. And then it's a transportation issue. And so those two issues, I think, are as equally important as delineating in policy who's getting acceptance into these spots.
Thank you. That makes much more sense to me. Thank you.
And it's just a starting point. It's a thought. And it just came to me after looking at the data and talking about boundaries for so many months that magnet schools aren't the only areas where we're creating inequity, right? It's happening through open enrollment. And that will probably shake out as new boundaries take hold this coming year, but maybe not. And is it something that we just at least need to acknowledge or look a little further into?
You know, I think for me, at this point, I didn't focus a lot on the language, but really spent my time just looking at the models and kind of reflecting back on the conversations we've had over the last 6 months or 8 months, 10 months around attendance zones. You know, where do we want to go? And I think it could be a different conversation based on the 2 magnet schools we have versus something that a new magnet school that came, you know, that was coming to the board. I think there may be different considerations there to me, or maybe it's long-term, there's different considerations there. But, you know, a couple things that stick out to me, and I'll be interested just to get some feedback from the community on these 2 different models. But Trustee May just spoke about her experience and kind of the ease of the process to understand it and to complete the process. And I think that's important. I think some of these get a little convoluted, if you will. Something else that just stuck out to me as I reflected on our time was really Trustee May and Smith had those listening sessions at a number of the downtown schools. And I think there was a lot of comment from those schools or concerns from those schools about the impact that magnets have on those schools. And that much like with open enrollment, it's oftentimes people that are choicing out into a magnet school are those that can, and that can provide transportation, that know about it, that can make the time to commit. And that can be a challenge for those schools. And so, you know, to me, I think it's simpler to go around the PPZ, and I know we're going to come up with some new term for that, and have some flexibility in that, and to be able to manage that priority attendance zone, provide transportation in that zone. So now all of a sudden you could go to a pocket that's maybe underserved by the magnet schools, and you could address SES through a PPZ. So we're still, you know, encompassing the neighborhood around, let's say Sorensen, but you could extend that north or east, or, you know, wherever you said, you know, these students are underserved. If we provide transportation there, that removes probably the biggest barrier to getting to some of our magnet schools is the transportation factor. And you could impact SES that way in a less cumbersome way to me. I think if all of a sudden application windows and you're looking at SES, it just seems like that's administratively burdensome. And I think that's maybe the goal, right? Is how do we open these schools to a diverser group potentially? And to me, I think another goal would be just to minimize the impact on any one school. You know, so we're not pulling 25% of any one school's population into a magnet. You know, you could look at Ramsey, we're doing that with Winton, and really it's out of necessity, right? And we need those kids to go there because we don't have room for all those kids at Winton. But I don't know that that's ideal long-term. So those are my thoughts.
Casey, I thought that's exactly echoed kind of my feeling in that, can we be more effective ensuring that our magnet schools do no harm to any one school more than the other? And so is it moving more in the direction that we write into procedure, just that, you know, instead of focusing on SES as much, we're focusing on the individual impact to neighboring schools? Because, you know, Sorensen's success did definitely affect, you know, Fernand and Bora and Brian, and it was overlooked for probably too many years. And so can we find a way to ensure that those school populations are not overly impacted? I hadn't thought about that that aspect of it, but it seems like it might be simpler than asking everyone to demonstrate SES prior to application. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
So I want to make sure I understand, and I want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So like, for example, setting some form of limits on the number of kids that could come out of, oh, he gets 2 votes now. Setting the limitations on how many students, for example, could come out of any one attendance zone could be done without even a PPZ at all, or an overlay, whatever we're going to call that. That's just something that can be written into policy, that no more than X number of students would be called out, or something to that nature. And I'm not sure that's even the right way that we'd want to administer it, but that's one tool, and that's a completely different tool than creating some flexibility in the overlay zone that gives the board the authority to move it around to try to capture some neighborhoods because it has a higher or a less population of low SES or high SES. That those two things solve two completely different problems. And that was a leveraging tool that we recognized early on that we didn't necessarily incorporate into this language to start with, because we weren't sure whether or not you guys were interested yet.
I will try to be quick. I would concur with Ms. May's comments about the 50% guideline, but also interested in more feedback. My biggest concern for Ramsey has been that the overlay or the PPZ would consume its attendance and it would lose its ability. So that's why I'm not convinced to totally let it go, but maybe that is the best thing. So that would be my comment there. On the SES aspects, I certainly would be leaning towards Model 2. I do think we need to take some consideration. I think it should be based on a district average of some kind, so that we're making sure it does come with a lot of tentacles in terms of transportation and how we accommodate that to happen. But that would be where I would be headed. Certainly open to more dialogue on that and input. And then a couple of things that haven't been brought up though that I wanted to comment on is the priorities with the teachers being employed at the magnet school, which is not the same policy we have for kids with staff. Just teachers have a priority of whatever school they want to choose to put their children in, as I understand. So I'm not sure why we were drawing the distinction with the magnet school, and if that's something that everybody was in agreement in. I just noticed it as a difference and didn't know why. And the fourth thing is the idea of, if you move out of the preferred priority zone, that you have to re-lottery. I don't like that idea. If our concept is once in, always in, as long as you stay in district. I certainly wouldn't advocate if you move to Post Falls or Spokane that you get to continue in our school district. But if you are still in our school district and you were in the preferred priority zone and you moved out of that, but within the district, I don't like the idea of having to re-lottery as that student right now. Again, open to dialogue and input on that. But those were the four things I took out of all that, my read so far.
I echo Jen, your comment, and I was curious why that change was made, that students had to reapply if they moved outside of the preferred priority zone. Because in the past, and kind of the mantra that I felt that we were using is, once you've choiced in or declared your magnet school, your home school, what does it matter if you move outside the preferred priority zone? So Megan, was there a reason for that change in the policy, or was?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that the reasoning behind that, and I think it all stems from what the board recognizes as the priority goal for enrollment. But for example, if the board adopted a true, 50-50, this 50% preferred priority zone, 50% outside, obviously those numbers get skewed if kids move outside of the zone and continue to come in. So we created it so it was a truly based on existing residencies. But it could be changed. The district or I think the administration that was processing it would have to spend a little bit more time when they were reviewing confirmation of enrollment to true up where they're at before applying the lottery, to get a sense of that. But all of these things really just are based and will change. It's like a puzzle piece whose pieces are changing depending on which way we want to go. So this really was supposed to be just a starting point to get some ideas of, I think when the board through these discussions and through the public input gets really clear on what their goals are. Do you want, and I think it was Trustee May had asked some questions. I mean, the 50-50, we tried to give you guys a couple of options to choose from. You may say, I don't like that. I want one, across the board application. And we could do that certainly. Or we could retain a few options so that the board could say, maybe it's not a one size fits all. Maybe Ramsey's enrollment goals and focuses should be different than what Sorensen's are.
Right. So I was just thinking mostly about our at-risk population with that clause that they are the most mobile. And so what if they do move? We know that our at-risk families might move 1, 2, 3 times during a school year. And I can't imagine having to ask them to reapply again, especially if we've gotten them into a program that's working for them. I'd hate to lose any of those families.
That's a great point.
Is there a way we can just hear from our principals? I mean, at some point, I just want to know what they're, at this kickoff point, what they'd really like us to hear initially at some point. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Cook.
Specific to what? I think they'd like a question stem if we're going to kick it to them.
I have a question. I'm curious, the lottery process, I think, is wrapped up. And so we've been talking about this 50-50 and preferred priority zone and just some numbers. What are they looking like this year, as we move forward to work on this policy? Could they kind of give us an idea of how many students were accepted outside the preferred priority zone as it stands currently? If any families did not get accepted, just kind of a general thumbnail sketch of what this year looks like so far.
All right, you guys, I think I've got you opened up. Can you talk?
Hey, good evening, everybody. Brett Depew here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, they got you.
Okay. Hey, first of all, thank you all for all the work that you do, especially around magnet school policy. And just much appreciation to the fact that you understand and how important it is to our community. So thank you for that. Regarding lottery, we completed the lottery last week on Wednesday. And in terms of if you're wanting kind of numbers related to how many are in the zone versus how many we accepted outside of the zone, I don't have those details to provide for you tonight, but I'd be happy to pull that together first thing in the morning and forward it to Steve, who could share it with you if that's okay.
No, I was just mostly curious, generally speaking, as we're talking about the 50%, in priority zone, outside, and families not having access to school, just kind of how it's working for you guys. And yeah, and if you do have any general, when you look at this policy, if you have things that stand out to you that maybe we're not catching because we're not doing it every day, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Well, as I think Jeff had iterated earlier in this meeting tonight, regarding, I think, both Sorensen and Ramsey, we're somewhere in that between 45 and 50% socioeconomic number, and it fluctuates a little bit every year. The big question, the hope that we hope to land on is a lottery policy that maybe gets us a little closer to that 50-50, if that is what the board is and our community is wanting. And so the big question is we have 3 possibilities here that we're going to be considering over the next however long, several months. And so I'm looking for how do any of these policies get us closer to that number any better than the current practice that we have right now. And again, I think Jeff said we were anywhere between 45, 48, or 45 and 50%. And so that's, you know, we want to do the best thing for our community. And so that's, I know for me personally, that's what I'm really looking for is I definitely, if we have something that we land on that's better than what we're currently doing, obviously we want to pursue that. My hope is that regardless of how this lands, is we have a policy that is clear and it does not put additional workload on our office staff, hopefully. And it meets kind of what we're hearing, you know, from our board as well as from our community in terms of a little bit of a better balance. So that's what Brett has to share tonight.
My turn. This is Crystal. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Crystal.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Just want to reiterate what Brett said. I know that magnet policies have been taking a lot of your time with the attendance zones and everything, so just want to thank you for that. We did our lottery draw also last week, and to be honest with you, we did not have near as many applications as we typically do. We had about 85 applications, and we're usually closer to 130, 140 range. I do think a lot of it has to do with just being out of the schools and stuff right now. And of course we had a lot that showed up, you know, after the window closed, but we did wait to do the lottery a few days to try to account for that. We have not taken anybody yet that is not in our zone because that's the way the current procedure that we have reads. We've taken, gosh, what did Teresa tell me today? About 45 kindergarten kids that are in our zone. And then we have about 15 that are on the wait list that are not in our zone. But we've, like I said, waited to pull those in until we see in the second window who else comes to us out of the Ramsey zone. At our other grade levels, for example, first grade, we have a wait list there as well. We took in a few siblings, but we couldn't take in, we only have like 9 spots in first grade right now after we roll up 5 kindergartens to 5 first grades. So we still have a wait list in first grade for kids that are outside of our zone, and by zone I mean the overlay zone, because we want to ensure that if we have Ramsey kiddos that move into our area now or over the summer, that we can try to get them in over the kids that are not in our zone. So a few years ago, and that might have been with the year, I think it was probably the year correlated, when we dropped and then went back up to having so many kids in our overlay zone. When Winton moved to their new building, that's when Sorensen and Ramsey sat down and looked at the process and changed our process, because at the time it was pretty much, you know, staff member, sibling, and then anybody in the Coeur d'Alene School District. And so at the time when we realized that especially Ramsey was affecting Winton so much, and as Dr. Cook has mentioned, so far Sorensen and Ramsey have always just held hands on things, we relooked at our procedure, and that's where it broke out into more of the steps that we have now. And I think, you know, this second proposal is pretty close to what we have now, and that seems to make sense to us. But at the same time, recognizing that we still need to look at making sure SES is balanced and things like that. I do have a fear that, or a worry that was mentioned about, you know, once you're in, if you move out of the priority zone, you would have to reapply. I think that would cause some angst for some of our families, and honestly, some of the, and I think this has been mentioned, but the higher SES families tend to be a little bit more transient. So I would hate to penalize them if they're having to jump from, you know, 6 months lease to 6 month lease, but can still manage to get their kid to school and have good attendance. So, you know, that's one of the things I would want to be mindful of as we work through this. And then also the staff piece, just being mindful of, you know, do they have to work at a magnet school, or could they just be an employee in our district and still be able to have priority at a magnet school? Is that enough information from me stat-wise?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal and Brett. Dr. Cook, on that that staff piece, I know the question was asked, but I don't know if we addressed that. Yet that change there, I think it's in our negotiated agreement that staff, and it's a little fuzzy there. Really, negotiated agreement just applies to contracted teachers, right? But I think we've applied that pretty universal, but it gives them a preference in open enrollment type decisions or magnet decisions. And so where did that change come from? And can we do that based on what if we were going to go down that path based on the negotiated agreement?
Yeah, so the way it's written in the negotiated agreement gives priority to staff that work in the district. And essentially for open enrollment, it's the number one priority for all schools that staff gets to be the first in. And it's a pretty good perk, and we actually use it as a recruiting tool because, believe it or not all teachers don't necessarily get to work in a district work in a building where their kids go to school. And so it's a substantial perk for helping us draw talent into the district. And it's one that we don't necessarily take lightly. I think where this gets challenging, or where this was a consideration for really changing, we got a lot of feedback that if you provide that perk at Sorensen, in theory, you could quickly turn Sorensen into nothing but teachers' kids, because if teachers wanted to choose to send their kids to that school, they actually would fall in as number one on the priority list. And the intent, I think, when we negotiated this, I wasn't here when it was negotiated, but the way it reads, I believe the intent to be that we're trying to do the best we can to help teachers have a pathway into the district at the schools they work at. And so therefore, if you worked at Sorensen, it made good sense for you to have the ability to have your kid come to Sorensen. I'm not sure that we were ever trying to, by that negotiated agreement with teaching, with the union, to provide a pathway to have first shot at any one of our magnet schools. And because we're only talking about, and I don't know what the numbers are annually, but we're talking about a total of 315 slots, more or less, for the entire school for Sorensen. It wouldn't take long for teachers to fill up some of those slots if we gave them first shot at that. And I think that was how that language got tweaked. And if I'm incorrect, any of you that are still on would like to change that, I'm glad to let that happen.
That was my understanding too, that was, once again, it's this idea that they really are two very different schools with different sizes and different everythings. And like Crystal, you mentioned, does it just have to be, can it only be kids of Ramsey, teachers at Ramsey, and a school of size, say 700 can readily absorb more staff, children of staff, than a smaller school like Sorensen. So I really do think that was, as I recall, that was the issue around that. So that might need some revision.
I just wonder, do we need to address that during negotiations and clear that language up as a district? Because that seems to me that's in odds of what's in our agreement. And I would agree with Steve said. I doubt that was the initial reason, but we've heard from teachers this year, I've heard from teachers, and I know Dr. Cook's heard from teachers and other trustees that are not in Sorensen or not in Ramsey or not in whatever school, like Canfield or Woodland or Lakes, and they're choicing those kids into those schools, even though they don't work in those schools for whatever reason.
Right.
And
man, I think about going through this. I'm sorry, Casey.
I just, I think if we made that policy change with the negotiated agreement the way it is, we could be, crossing ourselves there a little bit. That I think we'd need to first address it in the negotiated agreement. and maybe just create better clarity. So, because really that example, Steve, that you gave, Dr. Cook, that can happen at any school, right? If every teacher chose to go to Lakes or wherever, or send their students there, you know, with 700 staff members and 700 support folks and non-teachers, you know, you could fill up any one of our schools with their kids. So.
Yeah, that's exactly true. It's just exacerbated at Sorensen because it's such a small population size, and so there's just not a lot of space. But it's definitely in conflict with what the current language is right now in the negotiated agreement.
Okay, so it sounds like, you know, obviously, I think we've raised some good questions and put some of our thought process out there. Do we have more things we want to tackle tonight with regards to these? We have a few more things on the agenda. And then if we don't, you know, Ms. Brumley and I will work with Dr. Cook and Lynn and, you know, maybe throw out a couple of proposals of how we keep this conversation going, kind of what the next step is, or if you have an idea of what you'd like to see next, certainly share that now. But if we're just going to repeat ourselves, I'd say let's move on and get to the rest of our agenda.
I'm good for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. This is a lot trickier to do on one computer. Okay, so let's move on in the agenda then. Dr. Cook, next up is our look at the district attendance zones, the 4 or 5 schools that we didn't impact this year, and we're going to look to work on for the next year.
Yeah, this is Dr. Roscoe, Jeff Voller, and myself again, and Scott. I hope Scott's around for he'll be the communications guru for what we would decide. I think one of the things that we would like some feedback on is, as you all know from the boundary conversation, we got a little tangled, I think, and couldn't come up with something that really fit in a timely fashion in the boundary committee that solved the problems in our southeast part of the district, in the southeast quadrant of the district, regarding the boundaries for Bora, for Bryan, for Nan, and by connection that meant Dalton as well, and theoretically even Winton, because by trying to find some pathway through for how we were going to distribute those new boundaries, all those schools were impacted. And so we felt like it was a better idea to just hit pause on that and then to attack it on a different day once we got that all established. So we are currently in the process of filling those schools and enrolling those schools for the 2021 school year, and felt like it's a great time to start talking about boundaries again. In this lens, let's talk about how we might want to, what process we would want to move forward to discuss what whatever solutions we're going to be considering in those elementary schools in the southeast portion of the district, what process the board would like to entertain. Ultimately, it's the board's decision. And as you know, we had a very large committee working with us on boundaries when as we contracted with Flow Analytics. And we are actually still discussing the possibility of working with Flow as a provider of data and maps and things like that, and would entertain the relationship continuing with them in that fashion. I would request the board's input on how that process might look forward. I don't know that we're necessarily interested in the idea of bringing Flow back in as a direct facilitator. I think we'd probably pivot away from them and use them as a resource for data and things that we could get from them, but wanted the board's feedback and input on how best to start that process moving forward, so that once we have a recommendation, that the board has gotten the necessary feedback and community input that they desire, so that a decision can come to bear.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cook. So there's several different ways that we could go about this. I think one of the questions that we need to provide some clarity on is this work that as a board we're looking to roll our sleeves up on, whether it's the 5 of us working with admin or a subsection of us working with admin and doing some of that legwork. Are we looking for admin to do all this work? Are we looking for a committee? And when I say the work, I'm not talking about, you know, from start to finish. Obviously, the board's going to be involved in there, but really coming up with the concepts or potentially variations. So any input you have on that, so we can start scheduling that or putting out an application process or whatever we're doing would be beneficial.
Is it possible to maybe redefine a little bit what our goals might be, or where we want to end up? I mean, even a month and a half out, we begin to rethink where are we headed, so that we know where we're headed again. I mean, we know some of the changes in the north spot we want to see happen and that type of thing, but maybe redefining our goals would be helpful for me, at least at this point.
I guess my thoughts in just a procedure, maybe Jeff Fuller will hate me for this, but I know he holds sort of all that data of where we left with the boundary review committee, and at least in terms of those last couple of proposals. And I would suggest that becomes our starting point. I know some of the discussions had been you know, that we all agree that we need to have the contiguous boundaries, and maybe that's what Rebecca's talking about, and reestablishing some of those things, but also talked about grandfathering kids. And so I really think that from my perspective, the first step would be is to have a springboard that we're working from, and then, which I think would have to come from Jeff, and then we give input on it, and then we get the community's input on it, and it may include some caveats of what would it look like in terms of transition. And those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think I echo all of those. I think for me, the initial starting point really is a continuation of the conversations that Rebecca and I had this last spring for Brian and Fernan. And they didn't intend to start out as equity conversations. You know, they were really boundary conversations to start, but they really all went in the same direction. And that was what those schools in those areas are facing, and what's pertinent to them, and what does equity mean. And they just did such a beautiful job of describing for their school what their needs are and what their students are facing. And so I think it would be nice to circle back around and finish that conversation as a board, so we all could hear the same feedback and get in tune with what unique circumstances affect those schools. And I think especially if we're planning on making Bryan contiguous, we will be changing the dynamics significantly at Bryan and Bora. And so touching base with those families first, I think, is really important, and would be, I think, a good will moving forward, that we're hearing what issues are affecting them. And it could be, you know, one meeting with all of them that we're able to get feedback on equity and how it affects them, because that might really drive what the springboard looks like as far as what resources they might need, and class size, and their situation. Even for Nan, you know, I heard things there about how they utilize their facility that I wasn't aware of. And there's just things that you can glean from listening to staff and the community at those schools.
Okay, so I heard a couple things there, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I don't think I differ a lot from what you all said, but that maybe perhaps we need to get together as a board team and a Dr. Cook team and just establish what our priorities are with these schools. And that might even be just that may be initial, and that might be something that changes over time, right, based on feedback. But that we would do that, and then we'll start with a proposal. We'll meet with the 4 or 5 impacted schools, and kind of run through a similar process, but not with a committee. Is that right? It's going to be us doing that work with, or really admin doing the work with us providing feedback along the way, and us working for the community involvement or working with community involvement.
I think for me, I would from those schools first before we dig in and hear a recommendation from the district, because we weren't involved with the boundary review conversations, and it's hard, I think, to jump in and take over something that different committees collectively worked on. And so I would like to get some feedback from those schools prior to beginning the work, so we're not going back and having to get feedback after we've already begun the process. I think starting with feedback from those schools, for me, would make it easier, and it would be a fresh start for our board. Yeah, all of us, hearing the same feedback. I know that the notes were shared, but I think it would be helpful for all of us.
And that's what I heard you say, Casey. Maybe I misunderstood, but I heard you say kind of establish priorities, like Rebecca said, get together with those schools, and then start work from a springboard. But your question was, is this an us thing with admin, or is this an outside committee? I see this as an us thing. I think we have the data and the information from, from the committee in a lot of ways, but I think it'll be individualized to these schools at this point and really a board decision. But I'm open to further discussion.
I guess we're coming back to, we did priorities last time and we didn't get community feedback, and I think we recognized our guiding principles. In hindsight, if we were to do them again, probably would be a little bit different. Things like safety, things that we probably didn't even imagine because none of us were experts at doing new boundaries, probably now would find their way on a priority list. And so I think we would derive better guiding principles if we got feedback first, because this community has been affected more than others. They're not implementing the changes this year. And so I think hearing from them and then reconvening, it might even change our perception and our guiding principles. And it's unique to these schools. It's not the entire district. This is unique set of circumstances, and Board is having significant changes this year, and I think that's going to be part of the conversation. And so I personally would like to hear from the staff at all of those schools and hear what's important to them, and so we don't miss a guiding principle this time that it impacts them.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm trying to figure out, I guess, what that looks like or how we do that. But we can think on that if we're in agreement and kind of brainstorm and come up some ways we could do that. To me, one thing I think that's important that because our listening sessions before that we had were on such a broad scope, right? We were looking at the whole district. It was often difficult for everyone to get the same information of behind the why did the committee make this recommendation, or why were they looking at doing this. And I think, to me, now if we're focused on 4 or 5 schools, that's important. And as we make these presentations, and if we have option A and option B, that we talk about this is the strengths of option A, and this is why we're making these recommendations in option A, but here's the drawbacks, and this is the strengths of option B, and here's the drawbacks. And then we get the input on that. So we're not just getting input on, oh, this impacts me personally, and not knowing the story, but at least they know why we're making the recommendations we're making, or why we're looking to make the changes we're making. I think would be helpful.
Yeah, and I guess maybe I wasn't being very clear, but I looked at the context of the conversation as more as equity, not about coming to them with a recommendation about how their boundary is going to change. It's about understanding the situations that are unique to those 4 schools. And I wasn't aware of all the situations prior to sitting down and just listening. And so I think a bit of listening would go far. And so I'm not asking for input on what we're going to drive. I just want to know, how are they feeling? And out of this process, there was clearly frustration, but generally speaking, what does equity mean for their school, and how can we assist in that process? taking away what they want their boundaries to look like. But we're getting ready to get a recommendation from the district on an equity framework. But this is an integral piece in that, and it's an opportunity for our board to connect with the community or reconnect again and say, we value equity. We want to hear from you first. We're getting ready to write guiding principles, and this is an important piece, and you have a story to tell, and we just want to hear your story. I think for me, it was, I can't impart how impactful it was. And it doesn't have to be difficult. It doesn't have to be cumbersome. Ours was nothing of those. We just actually sat in a room and let people talk. And I think we could offer the same thing in 1 or 2 sessions. But it doesn't have to be as guided as, here's our recommendation. We're providing them the opportunity to give input on their unique situation. And we didn't do that the first time. And I think it would be valuable moving forward with the second phase, but clearly that's
do you see us going back again then, Lisa, though, after once we have proposals for feedback?
I see it's putting out there again for 30-day comment. You know, if we wanted to provide an open house, we could, but the integral piece is understanding what those communities are facing. And I think having the magnet policy a lot farther along and the understanding of equity in magnet policy is going to make this conversation much easier, because that was a frustration that we heard at all 3 schools. But I think we're tackling that piece, and that was a commitment that Rebecca and I made to those schools. So we're following through on that piece. But the second piece was that we would come back and we would listen again, and we would hear what circumstances they face and that are unique to those student populations. So I think it would be valuable, and I think it would only enhance our process. And I think it would be goodwill for those schools, more importantly.
You mentioned all being in the same room. Those were the good old days.
We all want that. 50 parents in one room. That'd be great. I would love that. I will echo that those times of coming together with those parents, I learned a lot. And maybe that was just being new to the board, but it was also just a way just to really see how each school functions different and unique, and what makes them a community, and how they interact. How we do that, I'm still unclear in my head of how we do that fully, but I will say that I appreciated those parents coming out and those staff members coming out and sharing, and the things that we really did learn, that I learned that I wouldn't have known had I not been in their space. So that was a really important time, and really important communication to me. But.
Okay. Well, why don't we, Dr. Cook and Ms. Brumley and Lynn and I can brainstorm a little bit and come up with a couple ideas or what we think captured what we said, and we'll send that out in the next week or so we can start planning, you know, next steps. Sound fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's keep trucking here. Next up, and this is really our last item, is just an update on the math curriculum cycle and the challenges that group is facing with our soft school closure and our social distancing.
Yeah, so this is not I don't think any of us are excited about this conversation. You know, we were fully on track to honor our commitments, and here we are now finding ourselves in a situation in which we feel like we're going to have to make some decisions. And so we're coming back to you in a little tougher circumstances than we hoped to. And quite frankly, I think we're disappointed as well. And so I'm going to have Katie present this to you guys, and just maybe we talk through what our options are, but we're feeling the pressure of a global pandemic in some ways we didn't anticipate that we would. So Katie, if you wouldn't mind sharing with the board where we're at.
Thank you, Superintendent Cook, Chair Morris-Rowe, and trustees. This is the very last thing that I wanted to be saying to you this spring, and so I am very sorry that we are not on track to deliver what I promised. When this happened, when we closed around March 16th, we had only met for about 6 of our potential meeting dates. We did not yet get to meet in March or April or May, and all of our attention was focused at that time on the shift to remote learning. We turned all of our gears toward that. And so that's where our attention and focus has been for the last month, as you might imagine. So given that, and given that we have finished a good chunk of the work and we're well in progress, but we still have much left to do in order to deliver a quality product, which is what I know that we need for our students. And given the fact that we are really facing some challenges in a loss of learning for our students come next fall, and we really need to think through how we're going to provide for those, make up the gap in the loss of learning. My proposal really is that we work to finish the Honors Integrated Math 3 and the Math 3 curriculum, and that I would work with those teachers in order to deliver that. But in all other efforts, we would hit a hard pause for now so that we could really focus on compacting the curriculum for math. And while that's really important for every grade or every content area, in math, it's especially important just because of the sequential nature of the learning. And that we would focus on really identifying what are the essential standards, how can we make up for what we've lost, and then how can we move forward in the fall, because I heard you loud and clear when you were speaking earlier in this meeting about really wanting to have a plan in place for the fall to make sure that there aren't interruptions to student learning. And then with the Math Academy, we would work on looking at integrating math resources, which is what we had on deck for doing next year anyway. We would look at that along with finishing up our curriculum work so that we could deliver a quality product to you, the one that we feel proud of and certain of, and one that we know that is worthy of our students.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments on that information?
I just want to remind you guys that part of our issue is that it's in policy that we get your approval on this, and that's why it's back in front of you. This is fully within your lane to give us feedback on and give us guidance.
I just had a question for Katie. You know, Math 1 was approved somewhere between August and November of 2018. And how has the course been modified or improved since that time? Or is it the same scope and sequence that the board approved at that time?
No, it has been changed. It has been every standard has been looked through and rewritten as an objective that that demonstrates the content and the context and the cognitive depth, so that we can have better alignment in our assessments. Mm-hmm. So there have been dramatic changes and shifts.
So what pieces of Math 1 and Math 2 particularly did not get completed or will not be completed for the next school year?
So it isn't so much the scope and sequence that wasn't completed. It was the prerequisite skills, the enrichment and remediation by unit, the formative assessment, all of these things that I'm mentioning right now were in progress. The alignment to the portrait of a graduate, and then the resource alignment by unit and module. What was not yet started was the academic vocabulary, the summative end of course assessments, the mission statement, program purpose and goals, and program characteristics, the pre-assessment, and then our formal internal review. So those pieces were not yet started.
So would you say then, I guess in good conscience, that some of the deficits that the audit found in our integrated math program have been remediated since the audit was completed? So specifically they found gaps in alignment to our state standards, rigor, those sorts of things. Can we have confidence knowing, sending our students back next year, that those especially enrolling in Math 1 and Math 2 are going to be receiving a curriculum that's rich, that's going to allow for the appropriate teaching and learning?
What we could do, Trustee May, is look at sharing out the pieces that have been completed thus far, particularly the standards, the scope and sequence, and so that we have those shared out. And that way it could work to address some of the gaps identified by the audit.
I'm not worried that you share them with us. I mean, you're the professional. I think you know best. I think I just want to ensure, I went back and reread the audit findings on integrated math, and I had a little bit of heartburn and sadness that we weren't able to deliver our promise to the community. And it's been a long time coming. We're going to be rounding up on 2 years that we first approved Math 1 before many people sitting here tonight were even a part of this process. And so I just want to ensure that the most important pieces have been fixed. And I think that was alignment to our state standards. And it sounds like those standards have been added back in. But there's just some details yet to be finished. So I think that gives me confidence that our students will be receiving, the curriculum that we had promised.
Trustee May, I just want to clarify one thing. What Katie was discussing was this idea that we would be sharing out with our teachers and our staff across the district this partially finished model as a good starting place so that they can start to modify and change their plans for the work as it goes and then continue that work to build upon and expand all those additional parts and components that would have come out had that been completed.
Okay, yeah, so let me clarify that. So currently the students that are receiving Math 1 and Math 2 are receiving the original curriculum, Math 1 that was passed in 2018 and Math 2 that was passed last year in August of 2019. So what you're proposing is that you get to staff the improvements that you've made so far so they can start becoming familiar with the additions.
Well, and also, Trustee May, though, we will not just only give them what we've been working to improve. We would be, with your permission, with the board's consent, we would be giving them a scope and sequence that includes learning that has been missed from this year. So it's going to look different next year than it likely will any other year ever, just because we'll be thinking through how to make up for gaps that have occurred this spring.
So just to clarify that, Katie, so part of the work that your team, that curriculum review committee, that Math Academy team is doing now is really identifying, okay, what are students going to be missing from March 13th through June? And how do we incorporate that into next year, knowing that we need to teach a student, let's say Math 2, but we need to fill the gaps of Math 1 that they missed over the 10 or 12 weeks. So next year's gonna look a little different anyways, because we're gonna be teaching Math 2 and filling in 12 weeks of gaps potentially.
That's exactly right, Trustee Morsrow. One of the things that we know that happens every summer is there's this thing called summer slide, where kids regress a little bit. And so we take into account summer slide when we begin in the fall. And we've been looking at projections on what's called the COVID slide, and the likely impact to learning in instruction due to this disruption. And so we are really needing to think through how we're going to identify where kids are, and then secondly, how we're going to remediate that. So those are exactly the plans that we're working on developing.
in any crisis situation, you got to stop, pause, and rethink on your direction. And I know how disappointing having to do this is for you, Katie, and I appreciate that work. And I just want to, you were on track, and we've all been thrown a big curveball. And so I think the most important thing is to rethink fall and what do we need to do curriculum wise to make sure that fall and that curriculum is as strong as it can be for all of our kids, especially in these math areas, and really squeezing them together and really helping to prepare our teachers to be able to teach well this fall. So
Thank you, Trustee.
I would just echo Rebecca's comments, Katie. I just admire your boldness and just commenting on the disappointment and the promises and unable to deliver, but at the same time, commend you for having a plan and wanting to march forward. And I think your comments tonight too probably can lend some guidance on what teachers need to be doing these next 7 weeks as well to align with what they're going to start up with next fall, hopefully in person, but it may be remotely as well.
Thank you.
So thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Brumman.
Katie, how do you see that impact in next year? You in your kind of sequence, you had some targets for next year. Would you be thinking you're going to kind of finish up this year and complete next year's work, or are you looking to use next year to finish this year? And
Are you speaking to math specifically?
yes.
Then yes. My goal would be to finish up the work that we were hoping for this year, as well as look at the continuing this cycle with this specific group. In terms of starting the work for the boost classes and the honors classes, we'll need to think through what that will look like, depending on possibly depending on what our situation is come the fall. But in terms of finishing the work with this group, I think that what we'll do is work to complete this cycle, and then also look at adding in the resources.
Yeah, the other thing that I think was in there was kind of improving on-ramps and off-ramps for students, particularly at the middle school level, to to have an opportunity to get into an advanced track. It's as you know, in our system now, if you're not there at 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, potentially you may never get through calculus in high school the way that the current system works. And I think that's an important piece that we try to solve sooner rather than later. So Ms. Town sent over a motion for us. Is there any other questions? So I'm going to tweak this a little, I think, just to pick up on what you guys said about getting out the information that we have currently, or the changes that have been made currently to the scope and sequence. So is there a motion to approve the focus of the secondary math academy as presented, and direction to share the information created so far? Does that make sense? Does that cover it?
Second.
Okay, lots of so moves and
Pick
seconds.
one.
Okay, any discussion on that? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Lisa and Jen, did you get in there?
I did.
You're muted, Lisa.
Aye.
All right. Okay, motion approved. And I'm gonna click over, but I think that's the end of our agenda.
Thank you, guys. I want you to know that this stinks, and we will stay at it, and we'll get through it. And thank you. We appreciate that. We're disappointed, but we'll get our teachers along, and we'll keep tending to our kids.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Sorry for the long meeting. Enjoy your night.
Thanks.
Good night. Meeting adjourned.
Night.